In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the throttle cable on a Ryobi trimmer. The throttle cable is the linkage between the throttle trigger and the carburetor. A common problem with the throttle cable is that eventually the end will fatigue and break off. It's also common for the cable to get kinked and it'll no longer operate smoothly. Replacing the throttle cable is easy to do, and I'm going to show you how. Throttle cables, as well as many other parts, can be found on our website. Let's get started. I'll begin by removing the accessory from the motor shaft. The handle assembly is secured with 5 screws plus 1 anti-rotation screw. I'll split the 2 halves by removing those screws. Now I'll remove the trigger and the trigger spring. With the trigger removed, now I can go ahead and pull the opposite half of the handle assembly away from the throttle cable. Now I'll remove the back cover from the engine. Now we have access to the carburetor and the throttle cable. While it is possible to remove the throttle cable from the carburetor's linkage without removing the carburetor, it's very easy to accidentally break the cast end on the end of the throttle cable. So I'll go ahead and remove the 2 screws that secure the carburetor to the engine. Now I can pull the carburetor away and twist it up while removing the throttle cable. Now I can remove the throttle cable from the engine. The large end of the throttle cable needs to pass through the larger hole in the carburetor base. And once it's through, I can pull the throttle cable away from the engine. Now install the throttle cable. First, the throttle cable passes through the opening in the housing. Then the large end on the throttle cable passes through the large hole in the back of the carburetor plate. As we do this, there's a slit on the underside of this tube, and that slit will accept the throttle cable. And then I just slide the throttle cable housing inside of that tube. Now I'll reinstall the throttle cable back onto the carburetor's throttle linkage. And I'll secure the carburetor as well as the choke plate with the screws. As I tighten the upper screw, I want to make sure I have the choke plate lined up as well as the wavy washer so it doesn't get pinched by the screw. And now I'll reinstall the rear cover with the air filter. Now I'll slide the throttle cable into the side of the trigger grip. And I bring the cable in until it bottoms out on the shoulder. Like that. Now I'll install the throttle trigger. The alignment between the trigger and the throttle cable is important. The end of the cable has a Z shape to it. You need the fat part of that Z, or the part that's in line with the cable, to be on top of the trigger. So I'll align the trigger with the throttle cable and slide it through. And again, I just need to make sure that this fat portion is on top of the trigger when it mounts into the handle. Now install the throttle trigger spring. It wraps around the back of the throttle trigger, lines up with the hole on the trigger, and then drops into the housing. As I slide the trigger and spring down into the housing, I want to pull the spring back so it fits just in front of the plastic rib, like that. Now I can install the other half of the throttle handle. I just want to make sure that everything's aligned, the spring, the throttle trigger, and the throttle cable up against the shoulder as I slide the two halves of the handle together. I'll go ahead and secure the handle with the 5 screws. Now install the anti-rotation screw for the trigger handle assembly. There's 2 holes on the shaft that you can choose from. You need to use the one that's closest to the engine. You'll know you've selected the correct anti-rotation screw location when the gap between the back of the handle and the clamp on the shaft is about 1/4 inch. So I'll line that up and install the screw.